Our lesson today is on phases of the moon. The Earth orbits the Sun, of course, and it takes 365 days approximately for the Earth to orbit the Sun one time. Well, just like the Earth orbiting the Sun, the Moon orbits the Earth. The Moon is a natural satellite of the Earth, and it orbits the Earth. The Moon takes approximately 28 days to orbit the Earth one time. And so as the Moon orbits the Earth, and since the Moon does not produce light, but only reflects light from the Sun, as the Moon orbits the Earth, we see different parts of the Moon. Today we're going to talk about those phases of the Moon and where the Moon is in its orbit around the Earth when we see the different phases that we see over the 28 days or 4 weeks of the Moon's orbit. Just like the Earth orbits the Sun counterclockwise, the Moon also orbits the Earth counterclockwise. And so today we're going to start by looking at the Moon, where the Moon is between the Earth and the Sun. Here is the Sun, here's the Earth, and here's the Moon. Notice that we really don't see any part of the Moon because the side of the Moon that is facing the Earth is receiving no sunlight from the Sun, so we do not see it in our sky. And the new moon is out in the daytime, and we'll talk about rise, set in just a little bit. Now, remember that the Moon takes about 28 days to make one complete orbit of the Earth. And as it moves counterclockwise around the Earth, about 3.5 days or after new moon, we are going to start seeing a little bit of the Moon, and we can see this moon partially in the daytime and some of partially at night. This is called a waxing crescent, and it's kind of a banana shape. 1 week into its orbit around the Earth, now we can see approximately half the Moon that is facing the Earth. Notice that it's always lit on the side that's facing the Sun. And so the part of the Moon that's facing both the Earth and the Sun at the same time is the part of the Moon that we can see. So here we have a first quarter, which is about half the Moon that's facing the Earth is what we can see. About a week and a half into its orbit around the Sun, the Moon is continually getting larger. Notice that we went from seeing nothing to seeing a little bit to seeing more, and every night the Moon grows a little bit. And so the next phase is called a waxing gibbous. Waxing means that it's growing larger each night. And notice where the Moon is in relation to the Earth and the Sun. Now it's getting on the opposites. It's moving towards the opposite side of the Earth and the Sun. And again, we can see most of the Moon that's facing the Earth, but there's still a little bit here that is the Sun is not shining on, and so we do not see it. 2 weeks into its orbit, or 14 days, the Moon is just opposite the Earth from the Sun. And this we can see a full moon. We see the entire side of the Moon that faces the Earth. All right. After the full moon, now the Moon will begin to disappear a little bit each night as we move around onto its orbit on the other side of the Earth. And about 2.5 weeks in, we'll see, notice that it's growing smaller, but we still see most of the Moon that's facing the Earth. This is called a waning gibbous. Waning simply means that it's now growing smaller each night. And 3 weeks into its orbit around the Earth, we again see only half the Moon that's facing the Earth. This is called a third quarter or last quarter moon. All right? We move on 3.5 weeks into its orbit, and again we see a crescent, just a small part of the moon. This is known as the waning crescent, and it moves on around and back to new moon, and the cycle begins again. So this happens once about every 28 days. In this diagram, it shows us from above where the moon is in its orbit as we see the different phases of the moon. So we're going to talk about that and decide when we can see the moon, or what times of day we can see the moon, when it rises and when it sets for the different phases. We will start here with new moon, and notice the sun is up here and the moon is directly between the earth and the sun, so we don't see any part of the moon facing the earth. This moon is going to rise about 6 in the morning, the same time the sun does, and it's going to set at about 6 in the evening, or 6 p.m., the same time the sun does. Now that's assuming that we're on a perfect day. It would either be an equinox, or imagine taking the tilt off the earth. And of course these times vary throughout the year depending on where the earth is in its orbit around the sun. All right, let's take a look at the second phase right here. Again, the moon has moved a little bit, remember counterclockwise, and it's moved a little bit in its orbit, and now we see a crescent. We see a crescent moon. Just a little bit of that moon that's facing the earth is also facing the sun. This moon is going to rise about 9 in the morning, 9 a.m., and it's going to set at 9 p.m. All right, moving on around, we get to 1 week into its orbit. We have the moon that's at a 90-degree angle from the earth and the sun, and again we can see half the moon facing the earth. This is the first quarter moon. The first quarter moon is going to rise at 12 noon or 12 p.m., and it will set around 12 a.m. We move to the next phase. The moon is now a week and a half into its orbit. We see most of the moon facing the earth. This is called a waxing gibbous. And on a waxing gibbous, the moon will rise at about 3 p.m. and it will set about 3 a.m. Now, we've moved now to where the moon, we're 2 weeks into its orbit, and we've moved to where the moon is just opposite the earth from the sun. We see all of the moon that's facing the earth. It's a full moon. And you can guess that the moon is going to rise as the sun sets about 6 p.m. and it's going to set as the sun rises about 6 a.m. Again, we move on in its orbit. We're now 2.5 weeks into the orbit. Now the moon is beginning to be seen less and less in the sky. In other words, it's shrinking. And at this phase, we will see again most of the moon. Again, this is a gibbous, but now it's waning gibbous because it's growing smaller each night. This moon is going to rise about 9 p.m. in the evening and set about 9 a.m. in the morning. So some of you may ask, do we see the moon in the daytime? Well, yes, we often see the moon in the daytime. It is out in the day just as much as it is out in nighttime. Of course, remember, we don't see the moon when it's new, so that part of it we don't see, where we see the full moon when the moon is just opposite the sun from the earth. All right, moving on, we go next to, now the moon has gone 3 weeks into its orbit around the earth, Again, we see half the moon that's facing the earth, half this facing, and that's a quarter moon. That's a last quarter or third quarter moon. The third quarter moon is going to rise at 12 a.m., 12 in the morning, midnight in other words, and it will set about 12 p.m. We continue on with its orbit. We're now 3.5 weeks into its orbit. Notice that it's almost back to where it started. We again just see a tiny part of the moon that's facing the earth. This is called a waning, because it's growing smaller, a waning crescent again. And the waning crescent is, you can probably predict now, is going to rise about 3 a.m. in the morning, and it will set about 3 p.m. in the afternoon. And then we move on back to, we're now 4 solid weeks, 28 days into its orbit around the sun, and we're back to a new moon. And those are the phases of the moon. Now that we've talked about the phases of the moon, let me give you just a few other facts that you might need to know about the moon itself. First, remember that the moon's orbit around the earth takes 28 days. That is its revolution, it's 28 days. And then the question is, well, does the moon rotate on its axis? And the answer is yes. The moon rotates on its axis, but it takes the same time to rotate on its axis as it does revolve around the earth. So the period of rotation is approximately 28 days, just like its period of revolution. This causes the surface of the moon, or the face of the moon that's facing the earth, to always be the same. We always see the same side of the moon from the earth. No matter what phase it's in, we always see the same side. The other side of the moon is known as the far side of the moon, or the dark side of the moon. Of course, it's not always dark. It gets just as much sunlight as the side of the moon facing us. And think about it. If the period of rotation is 28 days, and the period of revolution is 28 days, how long would a day be on the moon? And the answer is, well, one moon day would equal to 28 Earth days. So if you lived on the moon, you would have 28 days, 28 Earth days of sunlight, and 28 Earth days of darkness. You might ask, well, if we don't see the other side of the moon, the far side or dark side, has anyone seen it? And the answer is yes. Astronauts have been to the moon, and we have orbited the moon. They have orbited the moon, and we have photographs of the far side of the moon. No one has ever landed on that side of the moon, and the only way that we can see it is to go to the moon and orbit it, but because it never faces the earth. A couple of other things. You may have heard of a blue moon. Sometimes people, well, that happens just once in a blue moon. Well, a blue moon is when we have a new moon and a full moon twice in 1 month. Excuse me, if we have a full moon twice in 1 month, then that is a blue moon. And think about it, a month is about 31 days long, generally speaking, and the orbit of the moon is about 28 days. So the moon is rarely full twice in 1 month, but occasionally it happens, and that's where the saying comes from, once in a blue moon. Those are just some facts about the moon that you might need to know. You will need to know the phases of the moon. And that's our lesson for today.